Hello, everyone, from Murat Kalaman's page. Ready for something different?
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're looking at NATO's future, but through the lens of science fiction.
Definitely. A very unique perspective.
We're diving into an anthology published this year by the NATO Defense College itself.
It's called NATO 2099, the science fiction anthology.
So instead of your typical dry analysis, they've got all these experts, even NATO staff,
Yeah.
imagining things like space battles,
Wow.
AI calling the shots, climate chaos. There's even one where they bring a river back to life.
That's amazing. It's a wild ride through possible futures.
It really is. And what strikes me is
What's that?
how these stories, while they're fantastical, they really are rooted in real anxieties.
Like about where the world is headed.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like they took today's headlines and just dialed everything up to 11.
It really makes you think. Like, what if these trends that we're seeing today, climate change, the rise of AI, these geopolitical tensions, what if these become the defining forces of tomorrow?
Yeah. And one example that jumped out at me is how several stories imagine NATO expanding.
Oh.
They're including spacefaring nations.
Oh, wow.
Like Australia and New Zealand are in NATO
Really?
in these stories. They even have a space battalion.
Wow. A space battalion.
Yeah, and Jaegers.
Oh, wow. Like those giant robots.
Yeah, the ones piloted by humans from the movies.
That's incredible. I mean, it does make sense, though, in a way. There's this growing global concern about the militarization of space, right? We're seeing more and more nations jostling for position out there, developing space-based weaponry.
Yeah, it's like they took our love for sci-fi and turned it into a strategic brainstorming session.
Exactly. And I think that's really valuable because it forces us to ask those tough questions, like what happens if this competition in space really heats up? What are the potential consequences? The anthology doesn't offer any easy answers, but it definitely makes you think.
And it's not just space that's getting a makeover in these stories. You see a lot of climate change. Resource scarcity is a big one.
Yeah.
Like mass migrations because of droughts and rising sea levels.
Right.
Battles over rare earth metals
Wow.
that are crucial for, technology. And it paints a pretty stark picture of what could happen.
If we don't get our act together.
Yeah, if we don't start addressing these issues. But what I thought was interesting is that it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Oh, good.
They do explore solutions, too.
Yeah.
And they highlight this importance of environmental security. Like, there's one story where a river in Africa is resurrected. It's brought back to life through restoration efforts. So it's not all...
It's a good reminder that even in the face of these massive challenges, there's still hope.
Yeah.
And there's still room for positive action.
Yeah, exactly. And even with laser beams and AI overlords, they never lose sight of the human element.
That's important.
Yeah. So you see characters struggling with, like, the psychological burden of telepathic warfare, questioning the ethics of using autonomous weapons.
Yeah.
And they're really striving for this international cooperation.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about how we use it.
Yeah, it's a reminder that technology is really only as good or bad as the people who are using it.
There's one story, Jade Rabbit, that really stood out to me. It's about these new NATO recruits. And they're not just trained in combat, they're also trained in cultural understanding and environmental awareness.
Oh, interesting.
It's like they're being prepared to be global citizens, not just soldiers. I thought that was a really important point that the story highlighted.
Yeah.
Even in this high-tech future, it's human choices and human values that are ultimately going to shape the world.
And that really resonated with me because it's easy to get caught up in all the dazzling technology. But we can't forget about the human cost.
Right. The human consequences of our action.
And the anthology forces you to confront those ethical dilemmas head on.
It does. It really does. It's like this giant thought experiment. And it asks us to consider some really big questions, like what role should AI play in our future, especially when it comes to something as important as global security.
Speaking of AI, there's this one story, A Day in the Life of the Secretary General, where an AI is in charge of NATO.
Really?
Yeah, and it's managing all these global issues.
Oh, wow.
And they even touch on the humor and the anxiety that might come from having a computer calling the shots.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what do you think? Could an AI actually be an effective leader?
Well, the story makes you think about it. Like, imagine AI handling diplomatic protocols, international crises, even something like a nanosuit malfunction. It's both intriguing and a bit unnerving.
It is. It makes you wonder about the potential benefits, right? Like maybe an AI could make more efficient decisions, more impartial decisions.
Right.
But it also raises those concerns about the risks and the ethical dilemmas, like who controls the AI? What are its goals? How do we ensure that its decisions align with our human values?
Yeah. And the anthology doesn't give us easy answers,
Mhm.
but it really pushes us to think about those implications.
It does. It really does.
So we've talked about NATO transforming, facing climate crises, and the importance of the human element. But before we go any further, I think we need to pause here for a moment. We've got a lot more to cover, and I'm sure our listeners are already buzzing with thoughts.
You know, one thing I found really fascinating is how the anthology doesn't just list threats.
Right.
It digs into the motivations behind them. Like,
Yeah.
why would these things even happen?
Uh-huh.
Using science fiction to explore the why not just the what.
It's not just China might attack. It's like, what would even lead them to that point?
Exactly.
And I think Jade Rabbit did that well. It wasn't just about space battles. It showed how climate change could lead to resource conflicts and how NATO would have to change to deal with those new challenges.
I think it subtly emphasized the importance of diplomacy
Yeah,
and international cooperation to try to mitigate those risks in the first place.
absolutely.
It's not just about having the biggest weapons.
Right.
It's about building those relationships and working together to solve the problem.
And then you have a story like the Silent War, which is totally different.
Right, yeah.
They imagine NATO as a global environmental peacekeeping force
Wow.
dedicated to restoring ecosystems and fighting climate change.
So, like, instead of defending countries,
Yeah.
they're defending the planet.
It's like they applied the idea of collective defense to the Earth itself.
It's a powerful vision of how the alliance might need to evolve.
Yeah.
Because the nature of conflict is changing.
Right.
Those battlefields of the future might not be borders, but the health of the planet.
And it kind of ties into this blurring of lines we see
Yeah.
between the military and civilian. NATO's taking on roles that they wouldn't have in the past.
Like what kinds of things?
Disaster relief, environmental restoration,
Yeah.
even peacekeeping in space.
It's like they're recognizing that war and peace aren't so clear-cut anymore.
Right.
What does security even mean in this kind of world?
And it's like that saying, the only constant is change. They're grappling with how NATO can adapt to that.
Not just external threats, but internal change, too.
Oh, yeah.
Like how AI might change how NATO works.
There were a few stories about that
Yeah. Sorry, no names comes to mind.
with the AI Secretary General.
Wait, I mean, what are the benefits and risks of that? Putting AI in charge.
Huge questions.
Yeah.
And the anthology doesn't have all the answers.
Right.
It just throws these different ideas out there and lets us grapple with them.
Which is valuable in itself.
It gets the debate going.
It challenges assumptions.
Makes us think critically
about the choices we make.
because those choices will affect NATO's future.
And the world's future.
Yeah. It all comes back to foresight and strategic thinking.
Wouldn't you say the anthology itself is an example of that?
Totally.
It's NATO thinking outside the box?
Yeah.
Using science fiction to explore what might be?
It's not just predicting the future.
Right.
It's considering lots of possibilities.
Challenging what we think we know.
Preparing for the unexpected.
Like they're saying, let's think the unthinkable so we're not blindsided if it happens.
That's a good lesson for anyone, not just the military.
Especially in a world this complex and unpredictable.
Speaking of challenging norms, there's that story To Turn a Battleship.
Oh, yeah.
This young diplomat challenges the traditional military mindset in NATO,
Really?
saying we need to be more proactive, more preventative,
Interesting.
not just relying on military force to avoid conflict, but building international understanding, addressing the root causes of instability, investing in diplomacy,
It's a bold vision.
and probably controversial.
Yeah. But it makes you think about alternatives.
Right.
Maybe the most powerful weapon isn't a tank, but a good argument and the courage to challenge the status quo.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, I was fascinated by how the anthology explored the human element, even with all the advanced technology.
Right.
The stories never forget the human factor.
Like the psychological impact of warfare,
Yeah.
the ethics of AI weapons,
Need for human connection.
like in A Message Home.
Oh, with the astronaut
Yeah.
feeling isolated.
Reflecting on how fragile Earth is.
Exactly. Even as we go further into space, we're still human.
It's something to remember as we develop all this new tech.
We can't forget the cost of conflict, the ethics of our choices, using technology to serve humanity.
Not the other way around.
Another thing I noticed was how they explored partnerships with former adversaries.
Oh, interesting.
Several stories had NATO working with countries that used to be threats.
Realizing that they need to work together now.
Like Kiev Summit 2099. They had this new military alliance called the Petersburg Pact, formed by states that broke off from Russia.
So the old rivalries might not even apply anymore.
Right.
Especially when you've got things like climate change that threaten everyone.
We need everyone working together, regardless of the past.
It's a hopeful message.
That even though the world feels divided, we can still cooperate and find common ground.
This anthology has been quite a journey.
Yeah, it really has.
From the oceans to space, halls of power to battlefields, the past to the future.
All tied together with a sense of wonder.
Some humor, too.
And a real understanding of human nature.
It's given me a whole new perspective on NATO's future.
Mine too. And on humanity's future.
And on how we can shape that future.
Those core values that NATO has.
Collective defense, cooperation, democracy.
Makes you wonder if they're enough to handle what's coming.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Will those values be enough in the world of 2099?
I mean, it's a world of complexity and uncertainty, right? The anthology doesn't give us a clear answer, but it definitely challenges us to think about it.
Yeah. And one thing I noticed is how they play with those classic sci-fi tropes.
Oh, yeah.
You think you're getting a space opera.
Right.
And suddenly it's a debate about AI or the consequences of geoengineering.
It's not just good guys versus bad guys.
Right,
It's about human nature, politics, technology.
Those gray areas of conflict and cooperation.
There's one story, The Canadian Shield, about these NATO troopers rewilding a devastated landscape.
It's a quieter story than the others.
Yeah, more about restoration, human connection.
Rebuilding a damaged world.
It's a good contrast to the action-packed ones.
Reminds us that the future isn't just about cool gadgets and space battles.
It's about the choices we make every day.
The values we hold.
Those small acts of courage and compassion that add up.
It's hopeful, you know? Even with those existential threats, there's still beauty and connection.
A future worth fighting for.
And it comes back to that human element.
Yeah.
Technology is only as good as the people using it.
Right. We can't let it control us.
We have to use it for good.
To make a better world.
So why should our listener care about all this?
I think it goes beyond just being entertained.
Yeah.
It helps us understand what's possible.
The good and the bad.
It gives us tools to think critically.
To use foresight and imagination.
To be active in shaping the future.
Not just watching it happen.
Because the decisions we make today have consequences down the line.
The future isn't set in stone.
It's shaped by our choices.
By our actions.
By what we want the world to be.
So as we finish this deep dive into NATO 2099, any final thoughts?
Don't be afraid to imagine the future. Even if it seems crazy or impossible.
Like one of the stories said.
The real school of command is general knowledge.
And that includes knowledge of what could be.
Exactly.
I definitely recommend checking out this anthology.
So the wild ride.
It really makes you think.
Might change how you see the world.
Until next time, keep exploring.
You never know what futures you'll find.